We are in for a treat as we debut a whole new bar conversations where we have creative voices, local roots, and real conversations. Welcome to the 859. In our very first episode, our very first guest, we head away from music and go to the other side of the creativity, and that is the books and written side as we welcome in author Fiona Young-Brown as she talks about her book Secret Lexington, a guide to the weird, wonderful, and obscure. Fiona, welcome in.
Thank you. Thank you for having me, Jonathan.
Absolutely. And, if folks couldn't tell right off the bat, you have an accent, a slight accent.
That's
So
so
you've, um, so you've lived in Lexington, though, for about a little over 2 decades, but you came here from England. So how did, being an outsider, quote unquote, shape the way you see and write about this wonderful city that we call Lexington?
I think it kind of gives you a bit of an edge in some ways for noticing things that otherwise you take for granted. Um, and now I've lived here for nearly 25 years and I've started to take things for granted. But I think when you're new in a place, you're kind of everything is different and strange, and so you're really taking things in. I was already interested in travel and history and food, and so all of those things were things that I looked out for here. And I came here because my husband's from Lexington, and so I think because of that as well, there was also a certain part that played into the I want to kind of get to know where he's from, what his history is here, and so on. And so I think in some ways that does give you an edge. I know when I first put out my first few books about Lexington years ago, I had a couple of people come up and say, very angrily at one of the book signings, "What makes you think you can write about this when you're not from here?" And, we got to chatting, and I said, you know, did you know about this? And they're like, "Oh, well, no, but I drive past it every day." And so it was those kind of conversations. Um, And the funny thing is that now I've lived here so long, I have the same experiences sometimes when I go back home to visit family. There's things that, again, being there every day, you take for granted, but when you're away or you're kind of new or reintroducing yourself to a place, you suddenly think, I hadn't noticed that before.
It is amazing how that works, and I've lived here for now a little over a decade, and it blows my mind because there's still so much I don't know about Lexington, and there's such cool things that you find, and you did a lovely deep dive into the secret Lexington and things people may not realize. But the book idea actually started was pitched to you maybe like 10 years ago, and you're like, I don't know, but what made now the right time to dive into that?
Well, and I'd actually even forgotten about that until I was working on it this time around. So I wrote back in about 2007, 2008, I did my first book, which was Lexington Then and Now. And that was just mainly a photograph book. You know, Old pictures of Lexington and the same spots, 100, 125 years later, to see how the city had changed. And then that led into Wicked Lexington, which was kind of a lot of the fun historical. I always call it the history you don't learn in school. Things like the dueling in the streets and all the red light district and bell breezing and so on. And then I did one about food history in Kentucky. And then the Reedy Press out in, I think they're in St. Louis. I'm going to get that wrong, but they're somewhere out west. They had messaged me and said, "Would you want to do a book called Secret Lexington?" And I remember at the time I was just like, I'm done with Lexington history. It was kind of, I don't know what else I could say at the moment.
You had been very immersed in it.
Yeah, exactly. I was like, great, I've done Wicked, I've done food. I don't want to just be the Lexington history person. And so I turned it down. And I spent the next 10, 15 years, I was writing educational books for kids on a whole bunch of different topics. I was writing for magazines, websites, and so on. And then I got an email a couple of years ago from an editor saying, we're doing this series, Secret Lexington. Would you be interested? And I think I'd been away from writing about Lexington long enough. I was like, that sounds like a really cool idea. Okay, that sounds fun. And, I looked at a couple of other books in the series and said, yeah, okay. And it was only after I'd started working on it that I just happened to be going through some old emails one day and came across this old email. I was like, this is the one I turned down 10 plus years ago. Oh my God. But I guess it means, things come full circle when it's the right time. So,
Well,
and I do think
absolutely.
this was the right time. I think it's a very different book, or there are things that I included now that I maybe wouldn't have known about before. And so it was the right time.
Well, and I think that's what's so cool is, clearly things were meant to be. And, like you said, this book covers a wide variety of things from underground spaces to strange local legends.
Mhm.
How did you decide what was weird, wonderful, and obscure enough to include in this?
That was tricky because, I mean, one person's weird is another person's everyday or, obscure and so on. And I really wanted to balance it between things that people coming from out of town would discover. Everyone knows that when you come to Lexington, you go to Keeneland, you go here, you go here. And so I wanted to include places that they wouldn't know, but then I also wanted to include some places that even if you've been living here for 20 years or whatever, you didn't know about. And so that was really tricky in some ways, trying to find that kind of balance. There were definitely some in the original draft that I submitted. I remember I wrote about the narco farm, which is now the Federal Medical Complex, but had all sorts of cool, I think they're cool, experiments back in the 1940s and so on. And the publisher came back and was like, oh, that's a little too dark. I don't know that we want to do that. Um, and then there were others that, they came back and said, well, that sounds kind of well known, or, maybe not obscure enough. So it was kind of this balancing act of, okay, is it too well known? Is it too obscure? Is it too dark? And I'd also kind of tested out on some friends and around here by saying, hey, did you know about this? And see what their reaction was. And if it was, oh, yeah, everyone knows, then I was like, okay, probably not one to include.
But I mean, you were able to find a lot of unique things. And I mean, was there like one or two things that you were like, I never would have ever thought of that here, or truly surprised you when you did the dive? Because, like you said, you had done some history of different things, so and Wicked Lex, so it's not like you were completely unaware of some of the things that happened. But I'm guessing there had to be a few things that surprised you.
There were, and there was some, I mean, and already knowing some of Lexington's history was kind of a benefit when I came in, because when I started, I was like, okay, great, obviously I'll do this and this and this and so on. And then some of the best surprises came from other people telling me about something. So, for example, I wanted to go and look around the James Pepper Distillery. I knew that that had been a big historic distillery. It had gone through a whole, renovation and the whole distillery district and so on. And so I went and did a tour there and learned tons about that. And then at the end of the tour, they said, oh, and so you know the story of the mural down at the end, the big mural, the guy with the gas mask and the multiple arms and so on. And I said, yeah, I kind of remember that there was a big scandal about it when it came out. People were upset that it was gang symbols and so on. And I said, yeah, I hadn't really paid much attention to it. And they said, oh, you should go look at it. They said something. But before you go look, we'll show you the rest. And it turned out that the artist who'd done it was from Belgium. He had actually, this was before a lot of the distillery district had kind of been restored and reopened as businesses. And so they took me behind some of the old derelict parts that are still derelict. And he had gone through, and there's an entire kind of mythology and story that he had created And so, you're literally walking down these old broken stairs, and there's a part of a story on a wall. And so they guide you through the story, and then it finishes with the mural. And so that's kind of the final part of the story. Um, a lot of that is closed off now for safety, for privacy, and so on. A lot of it has even been painted over now because of, as new businesses are moving in. But luckily, he did actually make a video of it, of the whole story. Um, and so I do include a link to that in the book. That's available online. So you can watch this whole video going through all the derelict parts of that district and learning this kind of really bizarre story that starts with prohibition, and then someone's trapped in the distillery and only has bourbon to live on for years, and they mutate and so on. And so it put the whole mural now into a very different perspective. There's a whole story behind it. And it was one of those things that I never would have known if it weren't for just one person saying, hey, come behind this door and have a look. And so those were some of the best things to find, when people would hear what you were doing and saying, oh, well, did you know about this? And kind of quickly tell you something.
Well, I was gonna say, I mean, how cool is it to? I mean, like that. I mean, obviously, where I live, I drive by that like every day on my way home, and and have seen it for. That's one thing I vividly remember it all the time, and it's crazy to think it's got that much of a story to it. But I mean, you talk about like having other people say, "Hey," especially once they realize what you're doing, like,
Hmm.
"Hey, did you know?" So when it comes to the research for something like this, what does that breakdown look like? Are you digging into the archives like you have for other things, talking to locals, random leads? How does it work for you on something like this that you may not know everything?
It is kind of a combination of all of that. You know, yep, there's this, you start with kind of things that you know about and start digging into those. And actually, for me, one of the first things when they said about Secret Lexington, I just moved over near Alexandria Drive and noticed the painted pig, the Hemingway pig. And I was like, why is there a pig? This is Lexington. Lexington has horses. Why is there a painted pig? And so when they first said Secret Lexington, that was the first thing I was like, I'll do the pig. Um, and so you start looking into things, you start doing a lot of digging online and the library. But also then I found once a once people know that you're doing it, they do start all telling you stuff. Everyone you see is like, "Hey, I found something odd for you," and there's some of it that's like, "Okay, that's a little too obscure. You don't want that in a book." Um, but also, I did find myself as I was driving around Lexington from then on for months, I was noticing every single mural and everything, and kind of maybe I need to find out about that. Maybe I need to look into that and see what it is. And some of them were really hard to dig up stories about, or to definitely dig up accurate things about. But I did manage to track down the history of the pig and, a bunch of other stories that hopefully people enjoy reading.
Well, and it's such a cool book, and people really should, whether they have lived in Lexington all their life, maybe they're visiting, they're maybe like us, some transplants. So, you know, for those that, like I said, that how were you able to kind of balance that it was something for really everyone, and it didn't matter how much knowledge you had or little knowledge you had of Lexington, that there was something truly in there for everyone.
Yeah, I mean, that was the tricky part, and really relying partly on kind of talking some things over with my publisher, knowing that they were over in St. Louis, so assuming that they weren't familiar with Lexington, I figured if there were things that they'd heard of, then that was definitely too well known, not even close to being obscure. Um, Also, running it by my husband, figuring, okay, you've lived here, you know about this, right? And he actually also provided some inputs. He was like, but what about the talking tree in the shoe store? Um, I was like, oh, okay. And he was very excited. He was like, no, if you grew up in Lexington, that was a thing. I was like, okay. So we went to see that. Um, so yeah, it was just a lot of running things by different people and kind of having those locals who'd lived here for years, people who'd never been here, and me kind of somewhere in between and figuring out, okay, who knows about this? What is their take on it? And hopefully it all worked out.
I think it did, and it's like I said, it's a neat book, and like I said, you've written a variety of books, more than a dozen, including, like you said, Wicked Lexington, culinary history of Kentucky, different things like that. So, what's it like to be a writer, but also in a sense, kind of be a historian, and for some folks, this is a good way to keep some things alive in a little easier way than having to go to the library every time.
Yeah, it's funny because when I was in school, I loved history, and but I stopped taking it as a subject. And I remember my history teacher getting very upset. What do you mean you're not doing history anymore? And then I kind of ended up doing history in college, and everything I did was always related somehow to history. And I never really kind of saw myself as a historian, though, because that always, to me, I don't know, means I should be wearing a tweed jacket with elbow patches and kind of that. Um, but I do like writing this, but I kind of see it as taking history, but making people realize that history is all around them. It's not some dark, dusty book somewhere, but everything around them has some kind of fun history. It can be interesting, it can be fascinating, it can be random people and so on. And I know after Wicked Lexington came out, somebody stopped me one day and said that they'd read the book, and they said, this was great. They said, because it felt like you were just sitting down and telling me stories about the history of this town that I didn't even know. And I think that was what I was going for, to help people realize that, it doesn't have to be stuffy and boring. That history can just be fun.
And like you said, you learn a lot that you may not have ever thought that happened in these places, and I think that's what's so cool is, like you said, it's a fun book, it's a fun read, but you really do get to add a lot of knowledge to where we call home now, and where others hopefully visit and love. And as you dove into a lot of different things and so forth, is there just, I don't want you to give away too much, because you talked about a couple little things, but is there one that just really stood out that you were like, as you dove deeper, you just kept going down the rabbit hole further and further?
That's always a dangerous thing because I'm working on another book now that kind of is just rabbit holes and rabbit holes. And once I start, I love the research side of things. So, I find something interesting and I'm like, no, I need to keep going further. Um, I think it was interesting. One thing that I didn't know about, and I was actually talking about this with someone yesterday. Everyone knows of Lexington and horses. Everyone knows Keeneland and so on. And so I wanted to include Red Mile and some of the other horse related stuff. And in doing that, I started looking at the jockeys, the history of the African American jockeys, and that Isaac Murphy and the cemetery. I had no idea that the African cemetery over on 7th Street has something like 170, 180 graves of people involved in the horse industry. And there are big signs up telling you where they are. There are jockeys and groomsmen. So that was one, just that kind of something where I didn't realize the extent
Hmm.
of the history. And another one that just totally changed, how writing and learning about something totally changed my perspective on it, was, I don't know if you're familiar with the Miller House.
I don't think so.
It is out off of, you have to go kind of into one of the subdivisions way, way, way round off of Richmond Road. And I remember going to look at it a few years ago. It was up for sale, and it was kind of this big thing because it's a very unusual looking house. Um, and I went to look at it then and was just like, wow, okay, this is weird. Different, I guess, but whatever. And then when I was doing the book, I was like, well, okay. And I started doing some research and realized that the architect who designed it, it was considered one of his masterpieces. He was a world-renowned architect. He'd studied with another world-renowned architect. And so, all of their other pieces are in India and Europe and the Middle East and so suddenly I started learning all of this and then really learning about what they were trying to do with the design and so on. And so then it kind of gave me a different way of looking at that house. And so now I'm like, oh, this is actually really interesting when you realize what they were trying to do. So I love those kind of things where you go in thinking you know one thing about it and then you learn something else that totally changes your opinion or gives you a new set of eyes when you're looking at it.
Well, and I have a feeling this book will do that for a lot of folks on a lot of different things. And, you've been able to do a few, book signings and book events and things like that as it is out now for folks to get. What's the feedback been like? Because I'm guessing folks have been like, man, I don't know if I ever knew some of this. Or I'm sure some are like, it's so cool you mentioned that because I love telling that story and different things.
Yeah, it's fun when you get the people that do say, I had no idea that was there. Or, oh my God, I'd lived here for years and thought I knew that. I think a couple of months ago, it must have been just before we had all the winter weather and so on. I had one guy message me late on a Friday night, and he said, "I live here in town. I've been looking through the book. My kids are so bored. We have to get out and do something. Where do I find Smiley Pete's grave?" He'd been reading about the dog Smiley Pete, and so I messaged him back. And he messaged me the next evening how he'd taken the book and his kids, bundled them in the car, and they'd spent the whole day driving around Lexington to different places in the book. They'd get out, they'd look at it, they'd read the part from the book, talk about it, and then he was like, "This was just the greatest day of local history." And I was like, "Oh my God, that sounds like so much fun."
Yeah. No, that's fantastic, and I think that's what people can do. There's a lot of different ways they can enjoy this book, and this is bar conversations. Normally, when I'm talking on the music side of things, I always ask what someone's drinking their go-to drink, but we're behaving ourselves on the 859 version. But I do have to ask you though, if you had to pick one secret Lexington spot to sit down and grab a drink and have, maybe a good conversation, where are we going and why?
Okay, if I had to pick a secret one, this is actually one from the book, and I had no idea that this was there until I started looking. And it is Constitution. Um, if any of your listeners aren't familiar with it, I definitely wasn't. It is kind of a hidden speakeasy behind a bookshop. Well, a fake bookshop. Um, and I heard about it and was like, this sounds like the coolest place. And so you go in from outside, it does look like this old antique bookshop. And you go in and there's this tiny little room and just a little thing that says ring the bell. And I know the first time I went, I was actually looking around everywhere trying to find the bell. Like, okay, is this part of the trick as well? How do I not know this? But then you go behind the doors and it's just this great little bar, little kind of wooden cubby holes. It's great to just sit and chat, or you can sit at the bar and chat to the bartenders and watch them as they make the cocktails. And I've been a couple of times now, and it's just such a cool space. There's no TV, there's no sports games playing, and everyone's just kind of in their little groups. But I love it.
I love that, and that's a little piece of history that's I believe kind of on the backside of downtown and so
Mm-hmm.
forth. So it's a fun spot that folks need to hit up, and like you said, who knows what else you might find in Secret Lexington, the guide to weird, wonderful, and obscure. Fiona, thank you so much for sharing the story of the book and you and some secrets along the way.
Thank you, and I hope you find some more secrets.
We'll see what we can get into.